Harlem, 116th Street. Two names ruled this block. Nicky Barnes, the man whose face ended up on the cover of the New York Times Magazine. The man whose notoriety triggered a personal order from President Jimmy Carter to dismantle his operation. The most feared heroin kingpin in Harlem history. Frank Lucas, the man who went directly to Southeast Asia for his supply, who smuggled product in the coffins of American soldiers coming home from Vietnam, who built a $100 million operation that the DEA spent years trying to understand, who Denzel Washington would eventually play on the big screen. Two legends, two men who defined what power looked like in Harlem. And then a third man arrived. From Greenville, South Carolina. Nobody knew his name. He had no connect, no crew, no reputation that preceded him. Just a young man from the Deep South who had come to New York City because New York City was where you went when you had decided what you wanted and were willing to do whatever it took to get it. By the time he was done, Nicky Barnes would be begging him for a favor, and Frank Lucas would be trying to use him as an informant from inside a shared prison cell. Both of them would fail. His name was Cody Griffin. The streets called him King. And this is the story of the man who humiliated both of them. Cody Griffin started from the absolute bottom. Not the bottom that most men in Harlem started from, not the projects, not the specific infrastructure of poverty that New York City had been building for decades. The actual bottom. He arrived in New York from Greenville, South Carolina, with nothing but the specific ambition of a man who had looked at what his hometown was offering and decided it was not enough. He started gambling, not as a side hustle, as a profession. The specific skill-based economy of dice and cards that has sustained men in black communities since before the Great Migration. An underground economy that rewarded the same qualities that legitimate business rewards. Mathematical intelligence, risk calculation, the ability to read people across a table and understand what they are going to do before they do it. But gambling had a ceiling. Cody could see it. He looked around at what was actually generating money in Harlem in the 1960s and 70s, at the men who had real money, not gambling money, not the kind of money that could be lost in a single bad night, but the kind of money that built things and bought things and changed what was possible, and he made a calculation. He started pitching $10 capsules of his first product. Not because that was his destination, because $10 capsules were the entry point, the specific bottom rung of an industry he was going to climb. He worked on a 70-30 split, $3 for every sale. But here is what separated Cody Griffin from every other man standing on a corner with product. He could see 150 people in less than an hour, 150 customers in under 60 minutes, $450 per hour. Not because he was pushing harder than everyone else, because he understood something about volume and efficiency that most street-level operators never figured out. Speed mattered, consistency mattered, showing up every single day mattered more than any single transaction. He saved $4,500, bought his own supply, became his own boss. He was not yet 20 years old. He cultivated an image that had nothing to do with what most men in his position were projecting. No flashy car, no jewelry announcing what he had, no performance of wealth that would make him a target before he had the infrastructure to defend what he was building. He wore fedora hats, designer sweaters, suits. He looked like a businessman. Not the street businessman that the crack era would eventually produce, with chains, the bubble goose, and the specific uniform of visible underground wealth. A legitimate businessman, the kind of man who might work at an insurance company or manage a small firm in Midtown. He did not drink. He did not use his own product. 2 rules, non-negotiable, because Cody Griffin understood something that took most men in his position years and multiple failures to learn. The men who lost everything lost it because they got high on their own supply or got drunk and made decisions that sober men would never make. He watched it happen to men around him. He made different choices. He established 116th Street as his headquarters, built his team, earned his territory not through violence primarily, but through the specific organizational discipline of a man who showed up every day, delivered consistently, and treated the people working for him with enough respect that they stayed loyal. He was building something, but that had a ceiling too. He found that ceiling when the police found him, arrested on a possession charge, sitting in a cell, thinking about the specific mathematics of what he had been doing and what was available to him when he got out. The man in the next cell told him something that changed everything. Heroin, triple the money, the same infrastructure, the same territory, the same organizational discipline he had already built. But the economics were completely different. The margins were larger, the demand was deeper. The specific economics of the new product created a customer base that returned with a consistency the old product could not match. He made the switch. He branded his product, a cat head stamp. He gave it a name that Harlem remembered, and he claimed it was the purest product on Harlem streets. He was not lying. The purity was his competitive advantage, the same strategy that Fritz would use decades later on 112th Street, the same understanding that quality creates loyalty and loyalty creates volume, and volume creates the kind of money that changes what is possible. His operation expanded to Riverside Drive. That expansion brought him into the orbit of something he had not fully anticipated. Nicky Barnes. Barnes's crew noticed what Cody Griffin was doing on Riverside Drive, the specific quality of his product, the discipline of his operation, the organizational intelligence of a man from South Carolina who had arrived in Harlem with nothing and built something that the most sophisticated operators in the city were watching with genuine interest. Barnes sent word. He was willing to help. Cody Griffin went to meet Nicky Barnes, the most feared heroin kingpin in Harlem, the man whose organization stretched across 5 boroughs, the man who had built the council, the specific consortium of Harlem's biggest operators, as a governing structure for the city's heroin trade. Cody asked for 1/8 of a kilogram. Barnes looked at him and refused, not because he didn't want to do business, because 1/8 was too small. Barnes would not sell 1/8 to a man he respected enough to meet with personally. He told Cody directly, "I won't sell you that little. If you want to buy from me, you buy a 1/2 kilo, a 1/2 key, minimum." Think about what that meant. Nicky Barnes, the most powerful heroin distributor in Harlem, was telling a young man from South Carolina that he believed in his operation enough to force him to buy bigger, to graduate him, to insist that Cody operate at a level that matched what Barnes saw in him. Cody bought the 1/2 kilo, and then he graduated to a full kilogram, $170,000 for a single key from Nicky Barnes, in cash, from a man who had started pitching capsules on a 70-30 split. He tried Frank Lucas, 114th Street, the man who had gone directly to Southeast Asia for his supply, who had built a $100 million operation that the DEA spent years trying to understand, who would eventually become a household name through the specific alchemy of a Hollywood film and a star performance from Denzel Washington. Frank Lucas was the most talked about name in Harlem at that moment. His product was moving. His reputation was spreading. The specific mythology of a man who had gone directly to the source, who had cut out every middleman, every connection, every layer between himself and the supply, was generating the kind of awe that Harlem reserved for men who did things nobody else had figured out how to do. Cody Griffin went to Frank Lucas, man to man, operator to operator, trying to do business. Frank Lucas refused to sell him anything larger than quarter bags. Quarter bags, the smallest retail quantity on Harlem streets, the unit that corner dealers bought when they were getting started, the entry-level transaction that most serious operators had graduated past years ago. The same Frank Lucas who was running a $100 million operation, who had soldiers across multiple boroughs, who had supply coming in quantities that the federal government would spend years documenting, looked at Cody Griffin and would only sell him quarter bags. Think about the specific contrast. Nicky Barnes, the most feared heroin distributor in Harlem, the man on the cover of the New York Times magazine, had personally upgraded Cody from an eighth to a half kilo because he saw something worth investing in. Frank Lucas, who had built something even larger, saw nothing worth acknowledging beyond the smallest possible transaction. Two men, two assessments of the same person. Barnes saw the future. Lucas saw a small-time dealer. That difference in judgment, that specific gap between what Barnes understood about Cody Griffin and what Lucas missed, would eventually tell you everything about the kind of operators each of them actually was. Cody kept building. He did not need Frank Lucas. He had Nicky Barnes. And Nicky Barnes was enough. His organization reached its peak when he was still barely past 20 years old. $50,000 per day. That was what his operation generated at its height. Not $50,000 in a good week. $50,000 on a good day. On a bad day, $30,000. The specific distinction of a man whose worst days were better than most operations' best days. He expanded beyond Harlem. Detroit sold Baby Ray Peoples a half kilogram of uncut supply for $100,000. One transaction, one city, $100,000 moving from New York to Michigan through the specific network of trust that Cody had been building since his first day on 116th Street. He was moving supply across state lines with the organizational confidence of a man who had already figured out that the biggest money was not on any single block, but in building a network that connected multiple cities. That understood the specific geography of Black America in the 1960s and 70s, the cities, the connections, the supply chains that moved between them, and could operate across all of it simultaneously. He had more than 20 soldiers by the time he was 20 years old. 20 soldiers, a command structure, an organization. All of it built by a man who had arrived in New York from Greenville, South Carolina, with nothing but the specific intelligence to understand what was available and the specific discipline to build toward it without losing himself in the process. He wore $100,000 worth of jewelry every day. He had front row seats at Muhammad Ali fights. He drank Dom Perignon. He wore furs. He cleaned his money through clothing stores and his own record label. The man in the fedora hat who didn't drink had become something that Harlem's streets could not ignore. And then, in a moment that told you exactly who he was, Nicky Barnes got out of prison and came to Cody Griffin with a proposition, a $1 million deal. Barnes wanted Cody to be the middleman, to broker the transaction, to use the specific network and credibility that Cody had built to facilitate something that Barnes needed done. Cody Griffin said no, not because he was afraid, not because he couldn't handle the logistics, because he had learned something that most men in his position never learn until it is too late. All money ain't good money. If the deal went wrong, if anything went sideways in a $1 million transaction, and Cody was the middleman. Cody was the one holding the liability. He had not spent years building what he had built to become a middleman for someone else's risk. He turned down Nicky Barnes, the man on the cover of the New York Times Magazine, the man who had forced him to graduate from an eighth to a half kilo, said no. The government came for him in 1976. Federal indictment, tax evasion, and drug trafficking, the specific combination that the federal government used against every significant operator who made the mistake of generating visible wealth without explaining where it came from. He noticed the stakeout. He had been about to drop off 4 kilograms. He saw something that didn't fit. He read the geography the way a man reads it when he has been moving through dangerous situations long enough to understand when something is wrong before he can name what it is. He turned himself in. He was sentenced to 15 years in Atlanta. And in Atlanta, in the specific compressed geography of a federal prison facility where the men the government had taken off the streets of America were housed together, Cody Griffin found himself sharing a cell with Frank Lucas. Frank Lucas, the man who had refused to sell him anything larger than quarter bags on 114th Street. The man who was now one of the most famous cooperating witnesses in American law enforcement history. He had given the government names and information and the specific organizational details of operations across multiple cities. He had traded what he knew for what he needed with the specific ruthlessness of a man who had decided that his own freedom was worth more than any loyalty he had built over decades. Frank Lucas was in the business of cooperation, and cooperation required raw material, information, names, cases that prosecutors could build on, the specific currency that men in Lucas's position collected from everyone around them and delivered to the government in exchange for the sentence reductions and the protections that only cooperation could provide. Cody Griffin was sitting right there in the same cell. A man who had operated at the highest level of Harlem's underground economy for years. He knew names and operations and the specific geography of how product moved through New York's streets. He had done business with Nicky Barnes and had connections across multiple cities. Everything Frank Lucas needed. Lucas worked it slowly, the way experienced operators work everything, not directly, not with the crude bluntness of a man asking for something obvious, through conversation, through the specific social engineering of a man who had spent years reading people and understanding how to position himself in relation to them. He started asking about situations, about people, about things that had happened in the specific world they both moved through. Questions that seemed like the natural conversation of two men who had operated in the same city and knew the same people. But the questions kept coming back to one thing: murders, specific situations, cases that were open, things that the government had been trying to close for years but could not get anyone to talk about. The specific information that would transform cooperation from ordinary to extraordinary, from a sentence reduction to a ticket out. Lucas wanted Cody to talk about murders. Cody Griffin looked at the man who had refused to sell him anything larger than quarter bags, the man who was now trying to use him as a source of information to trade to the federal government, the man who had underestimated him on 114th Street and was now trying to extract value from him in an Atlanta prison cell, and refused. Not a heated refusal, not a confrontation, not the kind of dramatic moment that gets remembered and retold. A simple, clear decision that a man makes when he knows who he is and what he will and will not do, regardless of where he is or what it costs him. He did not talk. He did 15 years. While Frank Lucas cooperated with the government and eventually walked out years before Cody did, Cody Griffin sat in Atlanta and did not say a word to anyone. The man Lucas had tried to use as a source did his time in silence. The man who had seen Frank Lucas as a small-time dealer, Cody Griffin, had now seen Lucas try and fail at something far smaller than building an empire. Getting information from the man from Greenville, South Carolina. He could not do it. He came home and made the specific mistake that men who have done significant time often make. One more score. The reasoning is seductive. He had built something before. He understood how it worked better than almost anyone alive at that point. He had the connections, the organizational intelligence, the specific knowledge that decades of operating at the highest level produces, knowledge that does not disappear just because a man has been inside for 15 years. He still knew people. People still knew him. The infrastructure of relationships that had made his operation possible was still there, changed, evolved, reorganized around different people, but still there. One more score. He got back into the life. And then in 1985, the DEA and a SWAT team arrived at his penthouse during a party. The specific chaos of a federal raid descending on a gathering of people who had no warning, no preparation, no time to process what was happening before the doors came open and the agents were inside. They confiscated everything, a Mercedes-Benz, millions in jewelry, the specific accumulated weight of years of converting cash into assets, rings, chains, watches, all of it now in evidence bags. $200,000 in cash. And then the photograph. A photograph of Cody Griffin with Eddie Murphy. The DEA had raided the penthouse of a man who was photographed with one of the biggest entertainers in the world, one of the most recognizable faces in American comedy. The man whose career was at its absolute peak. In 1985, Beverly Hills Cop had just been released, Trading Places the year before, Saturday Night Live. Eddie Murphy was everywhere, and there was Cody Griffin standing next to him. The photograph told you something specific about the world Cody moved through, even after 15 years in Atlanta. He was not hidden. He was not cautious. He was at a penthouse party with Eddie Murphy, and the DEA was watching. He beat the case. 24 grams seized, 6% pure. The prosecutor looked at 24 grams at 6% purity and understood immediately that the case was not going to hold. 6% was not a distribution quantity. 6% was barely enough to establish personal use. The specific legal threshold that the government needed to build a meaningful case was nowhere in the evidence they had seized. The case collapsed. He walked out after 10 months. The man who had been photographed with Eddie Murphy, whose penthouse had been raided by the DEA and a SWAT team, walked out of custody 10 months later because the evidence did not meet the standard, and kept going. He was released at 65 years old. 25 years total inside federal facilities. The man who had come from Greenville, South Carolina with nothing, who had learned the game pitching capsules on a 70-30 split, who had impressed Nicky Barnes enough that Barnes forced him to buy bigger, who had turned down Frank Lucas's size and turned down Barnes's $1 million deal, who had refused to cooperate with Frank Lucas in a shared prison cell when Lucas tried to pump him for murder information, who wore $100,000 in jewelry every day, who drank Dom Perignon at Muhammad Ali fights, who made $50,000 per day when he was 20 years old, who spent 25 years paying for all of it, released at 65, King Cody Griffin, the only man who humiliated both Nicky Barnes and Frank Lucas at the same time in the same city.